Oh, what a great week. I cannot even say how honored I am by the privilege of being the last plenary speaker in the row of so many great speakers. It's almost wrong because I cannot possibly follow in that greatness. But then, of course, a good story has a denouement, kind of a letdown at the end. So that may be this, or this may be that. The title I gave this talk was The Idea of a Village. And I would like to start by just telling you a tiny bit of my life without getting into the whole conversion story and mess that it is. But I have really all of my life been in pursuit of community. When I was a teen, I did not grow up in a Christian home. Our family religion was sailing. My father worked to live and lived to sail, and so when the weather was nice on the weekends, which is almost all the time in Southern California, we were sailing. Occasionally, my mother, I guess out of a sense of guilt or something, would haul me into Mount Olive Lutheran Church where we would sing Onward Christian Soldiers or something. I didn't know what was going on. It was kind of interesting, but I didn't have any catechism of any sort, really. And so when I became a teenager, I had free time, a job and a car, and I frequented bookstores, and I managed to get myself into the Eastern religions and the New Age study. And I ended up, at a fairly young age, leaving school to work full-time for a New Age cult, I guess you could call it, really. And I was very, very happy. I lived and I worked on this beautiful property in Malibu, California, and I worked all the time, every day, and I lived with the same people I worked with, and we were going to be the remnant that brought in the golden age after the great crisis. We were the chosen people. And I believed this with all my heart, 110% of my mind, and I would have taken a bullet for the cause, honestly. But I was tremendously happy, and there was one moment that sticks in my memory very clearly. I was walking from where my office was down to where the food was, and I was passing people that I knew, that I lived, that I worked with. I'd been there a year or two, and I just remember looking into the face of each person and thinking, I love you. I really love this person. And I was overwhelmed with this sense of joy. And while the teachings were wrong, and it was a dangerous, almost satanic thing at the core, the experience of community was genuine. And I actually got kicked off the staff. I had a car accident. I was accused of having excessive animal magnetism and failing to transmute my karma fast enough. And so, I had to leave, and I went to Japan and studied with Suzuki, and I came back, and my next experience was at a place called the Institutes for the Achievement of Human Potential, where I lived and worked on the same property with the same people for the same reason. Only this was not a New Age cult. It was more of a place where people would bring brain-injured children, and we would teach them programs of treatment and work with families. And it was my educational experience, and I loved it there. I loved the fact that I could get up in the morning, walk down into the breakfast room, and have breakfast with the people that I loved. And it wasn't as many people, but it was still this shared vision, shared cause. So I have been driven, and my wife actually worked for the same New Age organization. And so the two of us, when we were married, we had this desire for community. And a lot of our life was kind of about chasing this, trying to grasp this ephemeral ideal of this perfect place of love and fellowship. And so I want to give you a disclaimer on this talk. I am actively involved in trying to build a village. Right now, I am all in. My resources my life. I will do this or die trying. So I'm biased, just so you know. I'm biased to what I'm going to be sharing with you. But I think that deep down, almost everyone has this great desire. I think you certainly do. Otherwise, you wouldn't have spent so much time and money getting yourself here. Why? Because moments like last night, right? The banquet, the joy, the overwhelmingness. Someone caught me crying. And I said to Andrew this morning, it was where heaven touched earth. And how we love and crave and seek and desire and will sacrifice for moments of that experience. And so how can we get more of it? That's kind of what I've been thinking about. The word community I misunderstood for a while because you make assumptions and you would think, oh, I know word roots, community, unity, coming into unity. Not true. It's communitus. There's two M's. There's two M's for a reason. And that's because the roots are not unity. It's munio, which means to fortify or strengthen or secure. So together we fortify, strengthen, and secure our relationships, our homes, our village. And so then you get communitas, which has kinship or fellowship, and then the adjective communis, meaning common, joint, or public. But it all goes back to that fortifying together what we've got. So I wanted to do just a very brief tour of community, Christian community. I'm not an historian. I have tried to be sure my facts are right, but then again, I could be wrong. So if I say something wrong, you can email me and say, that was wrong. And I'll be grateful. But we don't know a whole lot, actually, about the early Christian communities, the first few hundred years. We have a lot of records of what people said and did. One thing we know is that the church was not purposed at making people good, which is what a lot of churches seem to be about these days. The church was to save souls from hell. And so the very purpose of Christian existence was different. Of course, for the first 300 years or so, the persecution was widespread. And so the communities were actually kind of in secret with cool little symbols and who knows, maybe handshakes and codes and little fishies not on your car. I don't know. But this rapid kind of expansion of Christianity under persecution also meant that there was quite a diversity of beliefs. You had, at the same time in Rome, Justin Martyr with his school. You had the Gnostic Valentinus teaching down the road in his school. And then you had a heretic, so-called heretic, Marcion, teaching down the road in his school. And so we think denominations are crazy and confusing today. Boy, second century Rome might have been equally as difficult, even though it was the only church, it was the universal church, it was still suffering in those early days. And so there's a lot of diversity, which I didn't quite know until I researched it. However, there was one driving idea, and that is that Christians should be in unity. So regardless of the heresy, regardless of the error or difference in teaching, the underlying truth that we should be in communion and that we should have unity was dominant. Then you had a few little tidbits. One of the most disturbing, of course, is from Acts 4 and 5. I hate this story, honestly, with Ananias and Sapphira. And they're, I guess, joining the community, and they have to sell everything and give it all. And they hold back a little bit, and bam, dead. Whew. Kind of frightening. I like what happens right after it says they died. Quote, "And great fear came upon all the church and upon as many as heard these things." I can imagine. So you would think, well, in some cases, maybe they had to sell everything and join this early Christian commune. But that seems not to be the persisting model, because people had to continue to live wherever they were. This I found is just absolutely beautiful. This is the Epistle to Diogenes, 130 AD, author unknown. But I thought I'll just read this to you because of all things I found, this kind of creates the vision of what the early Christians were in their time and their place. For the Christians are distinguished from other men, neither by country, nor language, nor in the customs which they observe. For they neither inhabit cities of their own, nor employ a peculiar form of speech, nor lead a life which is marked out by any singularity. The course of conduct which they follow has not been devised by any speculation or deliberation of inquisitive men, nor do they, like some, proclaim themselves the advocates of any merely human doctrines. But inhabiting Greek as well as barbarian cities, according as the lot of each of them has determined, and following the customs of the nature in respect to clothing, food, and the rest of their ordinary conduct, they display to us their wonderful and confessedly striking method of life. They dwell in their own countries, but simply as sojourners. As citizens, they share in all things with others, yet endure all things as if foreigners. Every foreign land is to them as their native country, and every land of their birth as a land of strangers. They marry, as do others. They beget children, but they do not destroy their offspring. That implies something, doesn't it? They have a common table, but not a common bed. They are in the flesh, but they do not live after the flesh. They pass their days on earth, but they are citizens of heaven. I like that. They obey the prescribed laws and at the same time surpass the laws by their lives. They love all men and are persecuted by all. They are unknown and condemned. They are put to death and restored to life. They are poor, yet make many rich. When I read that one, I thought of the CiRCE Institute. You're poor, but you make many rich. They are in lack of all things, and yet abound in all. They are dishonored, and yet in their very dishonor are glorified. They are evil, spoken of, yet are justified. They are reviled, and they bless. They are insulted, and repay the insult with honor. They do good, yet are punished as evildoers. When punished, they rejoice as if quickened into life. They are assailed by the Jews as foreigners and are persecuted by the Greeks, yet those who hate them are unable to assign any reason for their hatred. To sum it all up in one word, which he does not actually do. Whoever wrote this thing, he used more than one word. Sum it all up, one word. What the soul is to the body, that are Christians in the world. Isn't that magnificent? Letter to Diogenes, 130 AD, author unknown. Took me forever to translate this from the Greek. No, I'm joking, honestly. Absolutely not have that skill. So then we had a period of the pre-Milan Edict heresies. There were a few of them: Gnosticism, Montanism, Sabellianism. These were part of the whole process of the clarifying of Christian doctrine. And with the Edict of Milan in 313 and the First Council of Nicaea in 325, and then later the Council of Constantinople in 381, the defeat of Arianism, which was the most divisive of the heresies, and then this policy for solving the problem of heresies, that you could get your council, your ecumenical council of bishops, and you could evaluate the problem, vote, and the Holy Spirit would protect the council, thereby helping to sort out what is true and what is not true among these early Christians. And then, of course, we saw the end of persecutions with the Edict of Milan and Constantine. And then the entire nature of being a Christian started to change, because no longer did you have to live under the threat of of persecution and martyrdom. No longer did it have to be a secret thing. It was now a public thing, and it began to become more political. And there were potential benefits, political benefits, to being Christian. And of course, this was a very significant change. Then, about 175 years later, began probably the beginning of the end in terms of the Roman Empire. And I wanted to contemplate just briefly with you, just mention a few things about the fall of the Roman Empire in the 5th century. Because the question we might ask is, are any of these conditions similar to what we may be experiencing today with the American Empire, with the United States? I'm not going to draw the exact connections. I'm going to let you do that yourself because I don't want to presume, but see what you hear and think what you think about where we are today and see if you notice any parallels here. From Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, 2 statements. The first one, he said, prosperity ripened the principle of decay. Prosperity ripened the principle of decay. That is a weird combination of words. Prosperity ripened it. So it was already happening. Prosperity amplified it. Gibbon also wrote this: the minds of men were gradually reduced to the same level. The fire of genius was extinguished. The minds of men were gradually reduced to the same level. How did Gibbon observe all this? I do not know, but he's crystallized that into this statement. Now, a lot of this next bit is taken from a book by Cullen Murphy, written in 2007, called The Fallen Empire and the Fate of America. He said, Rome eventually became dominated by fixers, flatterers, and bureaucrats who clung to power. Fixers, flatterers, and bureaucrats who clung to power. What I find interesting is that some of the most popular television shows today are also about fixers, flatterers, and bureaucrats who clung to power, right? You think about it. Veep, Suits, what's that one, House of Cards? That's a really twisted show and very addictive. So here we have 13 conditions contributing to the fall of the Roman Empire in no particular order. Overextended superpower with unsustainable costs of maintaining that. Farmers forced to sell land because of taxes. High unemployment rate and large numbers of people on the dole. Roman undercover operatives, the curiosi, spying on the citizenry. Enormous debt, debasing of the currency. The Romans had lost their patriotism and had an empathy in politics. Urban overcrowding and decay, jealous enemies surrounding them, unable to manufacture everything they needed, consequently a trade imbalance, imports much greater than exports, a shrinking middle class with high levels of inequality, fewer statesmen, more power-driven, narcissistic, megalomaniac emperors. You know, in the 400s, almost every emperor was either poisoned, stoned, executed, deposed, or exiled. It wasn't a great career choice, really, unless you were looking for a short tenure. This one shocked me, lead poisoning. They used to sweeten lemonade by cooking it in lead pots. This, combined with intermarrying among the upper class, caused what they called lunacy. But we don't have lead, but think about environmental pollutants and food pollutants. Invasion of barbarians, which was a polite way of saying illegal immigrants. So by 476, sorry, David, you can edit this before it goes out. So by 476, the Goth or Visigoth, no one really knows, the leader, Odoacer, deposed the Emperor Romulus Augustus and became the first king of Italy, and that was the end of Rome. Right around that time, in fact, 4 years later, two men were born at almost the same time. One came to be known as Boethius, and another came to be known as Benedict. And to compare these two men is very interesting because they took different paths, both of which were noble. Both of them are recognized saints, Boethius of the Catholic Church, Benedict of both the Catholic and the Orthodox. They were born probably in the same year, we're not totally sure. Boethius was a senator, he was a consul, he was made the Magister Officiorum, which is basically the head of state, the head of government office services. And he was martyred by the Visigoth Theodoric, accused of treason. And he wrote some voluminous stuff most people don't know. Probably his most famous work, The Consolation of Philosophy. And his work was very good and very important, and we can still buy his books today in many languages, and his contribution was great. And so he took the path of stay in Rome and work within the system and let it kill you. A noble path. Benedict, on the other hand, was born similarly to distinguished parents. He was sent to Rome to receive a liberal education. However, at least according to Pope St. Gregory the Great, who wrote a biography of Benedict, he was disgusted with his fellow students who were abandoning themselves to vice. And he decided to essentially drop out of college and leave. He wanted to save his soul, I guess. He looked at the environment, the corruptness, the acceptance of the corruptness, I suppose, as being too wrong for him to stay. And so he went out and determined to withdraw to a place where he would please God alone. And, of course, what happened, as you know the story, he gave up his home, he gave up his inheritance. He did what the gospel said, which is give everything away and follow me. And he followed Christ, and others followed him, and he established really the first Christian monastery. And by the end of his life, he had established 12 monastic communities, and he had written the Rule, which is now known as the Rule of St. Benedict. And within 1,000 years of that time, there were, I don't know where this number came from, I think Chris Perrin said 38,000 Benedictine monasteries in Europe. Can you imagine that? 38,000? And what was the effect of the monasteries? Well, they preserved Christian culture in a way. They became the center of Christian life in the wilds of the barbarian and conflicted European countries and the power struggles. They became the points of connection for the transit. The pilgrimages between monasteries were kind of what replaced the Roman roads system in a way. And so they became the, if you will, the circulatory system of Christian Europe. And around the monasteries gathered villages. Now, village is a kind of interesting word. It's obviously from the Latin villa, meaning house, and so village must be a bunch of houses. Technically, I didn't know this, but a village is larger than a hamlet and smaller than a town. That's by dictionary definition. But what happened was that the people who gathered around the monasteries were able to share in the liturgical life of the consecrated, of the monks who were living the life of prayer, who were demonstrating the virtues of chastity and poverty and obedience, who were preserving the knowledge by keeping the liberal arts alive inside. And those monasteries became not just spiritual centers, but also centers of commerce and of education. And so almost all education that was happening during the growth of Christendom from the 500 to the 1500, this was under the authority of the church. So education was operating under authority of faith. And so that was a good situation because it was purposed at creating culture that would nourish the faith, right? So for 1,000 years, you had this proper ordering of things. The authority of faith, education produced people. People's purpose is to go forth and multiply, create culture, and that culture was purposed at nurturing the faith. The monasteries also served as protection. There were sometimes manor houses and small castles connected or nearby. One of the interesting characteristics of a village was that in general there was no mayor. It was a parish council or a village council. So they were really self-governing. They were, in a way, the first kind of democratic institutions. And they were centers for agrarian activity, for tradesmen, for merchants and artisans. And the people who lived in the villages had shared values. Pretty much everyone had the shared values because it was a universally Christian culture. Now, of course, there were bad stuff going on. That's always been the case. There's never been a time when there wasn't the bad stuff going on. But the context was that we are a Christian, they were a Christian community with Christian values and purposed at raising children who would perpetuate Christian culture. So they had shared feasts, celebrations. They had shared space, the village green, the village square. And these were places where people could gather. And of course, many villages sat in the shadow of the monasteries where the monks and or the nuns would live the example of holiness. The rule of St. Benedict encourages 8 hours of work, 8 hours of prayer, and 8 hours of rest. Now, I happen to know the prior of a Benedictine abbey, and I asked him, "Do you really do that?" He said, "We try, but probably it's more like about 6 hours of prayer. Some of us just need more sleep." But that ideal, and the life of the monastery would ooze out into the village. The bells calling the monks to prayer would be the ordering of the hours for the people who lived there. And these monasteries and villages are kind of a lost ideal, but the concept of a village didn't ever completely die. In fact, we found that with the colonization of North America and the establishment of the United States, this village ideal still continued to exist. Not in the shadow of the monastery, because it was a Protestant America, and so there weren't quite such institutions there. But there were these nice little villages, and we get to visit them when we read books like Anne of Green Gables, Laddie, Penrod, Little Women. I think they're very fun to read. We see sometimes in movies, what do we see there? We see the one-room schoolhouse. That's kind of the center of the community. The church and the schoolhouse, these two pillars. We see festivities that all the people in the village share in. If you haven't read the book Laddie, Laddie, Laddie by Gene Stratton Porter, go buy it, read it. It's one of the finest books you could ever read to your family. And there's this one scene, it's so humorous. The whole village comes together on Christmas night for the big activity, a spelling bee. And it's just so funny because some of the adults don't spell as well as some of the young people. So it's a fair competition. And so they have this thing, and this is a tradition. And I was thinking, now how many families could I convince to give up Christmas night to come and do a spelling bee together? But, it's just a little window into the past, because let's face it, there's no internet, there's no televisions, there's nothing to do. Nothing to do. You have to make up your own. So what else did they share, these American villages? Well, that families would trust each other completely. Why? Because they had shared values, shared visions, shared priorities. The church being central very often to the village, oftentimes the people there would be of the same denominational persuasion, or at least very tolerant of other denominational persuasions, and a tremendous amount of community cooperation. If you needed something, like a bridge, there was no one else to do it, no Department of Public Works for the state. You built your bridge in community. And the result, of course, is this was a very healthy place to grow up. I came across a charming book, which I didn't know existed. I bet you didn't. You know Louisa May Alcott because of Little Women, Little Men, right? She wrote a book called Jack and Jill. And it starts out with Jack and Jill sledding down a hill and getting injured. Broke his crown. Jill came tumbling after. So she wrote a whole book on that nursery rhyme. And the setting of this book is Harmony Village. So I don't know if she was writing in hyperbole or idealism, perhaps. But there's so many things I wish I could read you out of this book. But at one point, the little girls, who are all about 10, 11, 12, they want to start a missionary club because they want to go to where the crocodiles are and save the babies and help them, teach them to be Christians. And one of the mothers says, well, you don't have to go to Africa to be missionaries. You can serve other families right here where we are. So they start their little missionary club. I'm just going to read you one paragraph from this book. There were a great many clubs in Harmony Village, but as we intend to interest ourselves with the affairs of the young folks only, we need not dwell upon the intellectual amusements of the elders. In summer, the boys devoted themselves to baseball, the girls to boating, and all got rosy, stout, and strong in these healthful exercises. In winter, the lads had their debating club, and the lasses a dramatic club. At the former, astonishing bursts of oratory were heard. At the latter, everything was boldly attempted, from Romeo and Juliet to Mother Goose's immortal melodies. The two clubs frequently met and mingled their attractions in a really entertaining manner, for the speakers made good actors and the young actresses were most appreciative listeners to the eloquence of each budding Demosthenes. You love it. This book, I just found it. It's public domain, and I own a printing company, so I was able just to print up, a bunch of them, and I read it with my little book club, and the children just loved it because it's this view into a world where the popular culture of the village of that time was to teach you how to be good. Whereas the popular culture today, for so many young people, is kind of teaching how to be bad and get away with it, right? I mean, even I grew up, I think, in a world where the drive was how to be bad and not get caught. Whereas when you read this book and others of its type, you realize that what they're really teaching is how to overcome the tendency toward badness and experience the joy of being good. And that's what children's literature was. And that's what the village was. And we saw then the village, of course, expanding into the cities through the ghettos. And, ghetto has a negative connotation. It's where poor people live. But originally, what was it? It was the ethnic section of the city. It was the place where people with shared values, shared history, like goals, could gather and live. You get a little picture into this with books like The Chosen by Chaim Potok, and you see the Jewish subcommunity in New York, or A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, where you see this community of people in the city, but holding on to their village values. So part of what I've been very interested in is asking the question, can we recapture or restore this world of innocence? Can we really actually create a subculture that is separate enough from the popular culture where goodness and truth and beauty and being good and striving for that and doing good, where that is kind of a universal ideal held by the whole community? And in pursuit of this, to some degree, I came across, and perhaps you may have too, some writing by Rod Dreher, who was here last year, if you recall. He wrote an article called The Benedict Option, and he is now currently finishing a book by that same title, The Benedict Option. This is a reference to the very end of Alistair MacIntyre's book, After Virtue, where he asked the question, do we perhaps need a new Benedict? Do we need someone to lead us out of the crumbling, corrupt world of the cities of where we are, and go apart and perhaps be a separate and self-chosen people? And so the desire, of course, is to minimize the negative effects of the popular non-Christian or anti-Christian culture. I mean, you don't have to look at the news or surf the internet or drive down the street very long to come to the stark and painful realization that we simply do not live in a Christian culture anymore. You can hardly watch anything on a screen, movie, television, that doesn't explicitly or implicitly condone extramarital sexual relationships. It's ubiquitous, and it's so normal that children growing up can't perceive it as abnormal, no matter how we might try to teach them the truth about this. The culture trumps the doctrine in so many cases. Can we live in a place where our shared values as Christians can trump the popular culture? And it is pervasive, it is absolutely toxic, and it's like green gas. It's like chartreuse poison gas. You can't totally escape it, but can you minimize the effects? Is it possible that you could create a community where you could share on a daily basis the joys and burdens of other like-minded Christian people, where you could grow that vision, and in doing so, grow your faith? Could we build this together? Now, Rod Dreher, in his Benedict Option content, does talk a bit about the rule of Saint Benedict, and points out a few things that can be adopted by the non-religious. So the non-monastic families can benefit from studying the rule. And he points out that it's order, that there's an order to life, and that there's properly ordered desires. This corresponds, I think, a lot with what Theophan the Recluse wrote in the 1800s on raising children. You would wonder, what would a guy named Theophan the Recluse know about raising children? But there's a book called Raising Them Right by Theophan the Recluse. Anyway, his argument is that the whole purpose of education is really the creation of appetites. that the end of education is to create, what are your desires? What do you want? And to create appetites is what we do with children. And of course, the appetites of Christians should be to follow Christ. So far, so good. Premise 1, education creates appetites. Premise 2, appetite should be to follow Christ. Premise 3, I didn't like. Following Christ means living a life of service, selflessness, surrender, and sacrifice, and suffering. I don't like any of that stuff, honestly. I mean, service is okay if you get paid. Surrender and selflessness, well, that's why you get married. But this suffering business, no, that's not my appetite. I don't really have an appetite for suffering. How am I going to educate my children to this appetite when I don't have it? I don't know the answer, but it is one reason I moved from California to Oklahoma, so my children could suffer. Because in Oklahoma, we have ticks and chiggers and cottonmouths and copperheads and brutally hot summers and ice storms, tornadoes. Now we have earthquakes too. It's an awful place to live. But it might be better for the soul, especially given the non-soul of California these days. What we see from the rule is the place of prayer throughout the day. We are commanded to pray unceasingly. Well, how do we do that? I think a lot of us just walk around and say, yep, in the back of my mind, I am praying right now. I got this subconscious prayer going on all the time. But what do the monks do? They order their lives according to the liturgy of the hours. And they are structured and consistent, and they follow this discipline of prayer. Can we do that in our families? It's hard. It's actually easier when you live with a bunch of other families who are trying to do this too, because then it becomes a new norm, you see? Work, he talks about the importance of work, and I think the great benefit of the village historically, and I even see this a little bit where I live, is young people can very quickly and easily join in the work of the adults, not just within the family, but within the whole community, so that it is like an extended merging of homes, and that this opportunity for young people to work is tremendously important. In fact, John Taylor Gatto, many of you know, he wrote Dumbing Us Down, The Hidden Curriculum, Compulsory Education, Underground History of American Education. He said what every 13-year-old needs most is real, honest-to-God, meaningful, life and death level responsibility, which is exactly what schools prevent from ever happening. And so in community, I employ probably young people. You can edit that one out too, David. Because they get to work beside their parents. They get to work beside each other. And what they do is real, honest God, meaningful responsibility. Stability, putting down roots, and hospitality. I think that what we see is that this rule has been tremendously durable for 1,500 years. It has built communities, both religious and peripheral. And what these rules do is they physicalize our faith and allow us to keep telling our story to ourselves. We need to keep telling our story to ourselves, don't we? That's why we keep coming to CiRCE conferences, because it's a great place where we can tell and hear and share in the story. The Divine Comedy, of course, divided into the Purgatory, the Inferno, Purgatory, and the Paradiso. The Paradiso is a vision of the perfect community, is it not? The communion of saints, the eternal joy. And I think that's what I've always been striving for, is I want to see heaven touch earth. I live for the moments where heaven touches earth. And I have this kind of strange strange concept I will share with you. This has no theological support from anyone at all, anywhere. It's just my mental construct. And you can just laugh it off if you want. But it's my understanding of the mathematics of love and the nature of heaven. So here's my idea. When you get married, as most of you have, and some of you may, you have more love in your life because what you had was you and God, and now you can share that love with some other person. So you have a multiplication of love. There's more love in your life when you get married because you make sacrifices and you adore each other if it's all going right. And so the love of God is amplified by that multiplicative power of 2, right? So you're at least twice as much love as you had before. If you don't have any love from God, it's very difficult to have love for anyone, real, meaningful. Then, if you are blessed, you have a child. Now you have a case where you have a sacrificial level of love, a love that would allow you to give up your life for another human being. Now there's 3 of you. So it's not just times 3, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It's exponential. So now you have, with your first child, the possibility of 6 times the love that you just had between you and God. Now, some people don't get married and they live a life of celibacy, or they live a life of total consecration to God. And the love of God is infinite, so there's no limit. But for most of us, we're called forth to multiply. And so we multiply. Now what happens when you have your next child? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. It's 12 connections of people who love each other, theoretically, enough that they would give up their life for each other. Pure love. Now what happens as you keep having children? It's an exponential experience. Now, what happens if you live in a community with dozens of people who you love that way, with the perfect love of the saints for one another? No greater love hath a man this, that he give his life for his brother or sister. Think about that. Now think about heaven. Perfectly purified people who absolutely love each other. And there's an exponential connection here because there's a connection between every single person and every other single person. Isn't that cool? I mean, just to contemplate the potential joy of heaven. So I think that we seek this, we strive for this, we long for this. We come to conferences like this. You know, and I was crying last night. Someone caught me, and I said, that's what happens when you get old. But then I said, no, you know what happens is the older you get, the more you understand we're touching reality. We cry when I give our daughter away at a wedding. Why? Because it's real. We cry at weddings and funerals. Sometimes we cry maybe in church liturgies. Why? Because we're touching reality. So if a young child, right, stubbing your toe is touching reality, and you cry. But for us, it's a different kind of cry. It's often a joy cry. Right, Chris? So this is what we are thinking here with the Benedict option. This is not running away. It's not running away from the corrupt civilization so much as it's running toward communities, which may, as in my case, be physically people gathering together in a rural place for the purpose of shared goals, values, desires, and we happen to be very fortunate to be in the shadow of a monastery, which is even a greater bonding experience, but it's not necessarily. Many people will find this in their other communities. Their church or their school can become this type of village community, but it's not going to happen by accident because the world hates it. The world will try to prevent this from happening, and there will be criticizers, and people will accuse you of cults, being a cult, and people will laugh and scoff. And so if you're going to make a village experience happen in your homeschool group, in your school where you're trying to build that community, in your church, you have to work very hard. But it doesn't have to be out in the middle of nowhere, although there are some advantages, like ticks and chiggers and cottonmouths and copperheads and tornadoes, etc. But this, I believe, is perhaps what some of us are called to do, to gather together in community with the idea of a village that will allow us to help preserve some of the best of Western Christian culture that we have. You know, you can do good things on your own. You can read a good book and talk to yourself about it, and that's a great thing. But isn't it much better to be able to read a good book and talk with a group of people? Isn't that more fulfilling? You can sing to yourself, and some people do. It's easier to sing with your whole family, although sometimes getting the teenagers to cooperate can be a challenge. But when you're around a campfire with 20 other families, it's easy to sing, right? I think probably 95% of us would not have actually sung any songs this morning without the benefit of our village here. And yet that was a beautiful, enriching thing. You can dance alone, and that's weird. You can dance with your daughter for a little while before it gets to be kind of, okay, we did that, we're done. But when you have a whole village, you can schedule a dance, and you can dance for hours. And so these things that we find that so many of them are good are easier in community. So I want to encourage you to continue to contemplate this, because if indeed we see perhaps a collapsing empire and a time of great darkness and difficulty, either in our lives or our children's lives, or perhaps our grandchildren's lives, who will be able to wake up and then reteach how to sing the songs and how to dance the dances and how to love one another? So I hope you will be an example. And if you would like to come and visit, I would be happy for you to come and visit us and catch the vision. We are in eastern Oklahoma, about an hour east of Tulsa. And if you like the idea, you can stay in the guest house at a Benedictine monastery. You can hear the bells. You can pray the Liturgy of the Hours. And depending on which time you come, you might hit a community musicale. You might be privileged to participate in a Civil War ball that we have every couple months. Around Christmas, you could hear our choir practice. And it is the young adults, teenagers and young adults, it's transcendent. You might see a group of teenagers engaged in a sweaty game of ludus disci infrendi. That is Latin for ultimate frisbee. The game of the unbridled disc. If you come on a particular Saturday in March, you could join in monastery workday with hundreds of other people who go and serve the monks and help them accomplish much. And you possibly could show up at a time when we might have a wedding or even a funeral happening in a tent in the field. And the bells of the monastery ring. So I want to finish up here. I know I'm 1 minute over, but David's very patient. I found this very interesting. I don't think the author himself is necessarily Christian. Rodney Stark wrote a book called The Rise of Christianity. I'm going to finish up with a quote from his book. Christianity served as a revitalization movement that arose in response to the misery, chaos, fear, and brutality of life in the urban Greco-Roman world. Christianity revitalized life by providing new norms and new kinds of social relationships able to cope with the many urgent problems. To cities filled with homeless and impoverished, Christianity offered charity as well as hope. To cities with newcomers and strangers, Christianity offered an immediate basis for attachment. To cities filled with orphans and widows, Christianity provided a new and expanded sense of family. To cities torn by violent ethnic strife, Christianity offered a new basis for social solidarity. And to cities faced with epidemics, fire, earthquake, Christianity offered effective nursing services. For what they brought was not simply an urban movement, but a new culture. And if we're going then to be prepared to restore Christian culture, I think we are best off to consider how we can do that together and create villages. So, thank you very much. God bless you.